From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The terror attack in Christchurch on Friday was the worst act of terrorism on our shores. It was, in fact, one of the worst globally in recent times. It has exposed a range of weaknesses in New Zealand's gun laws. The clear lesson from history around the world is that to make our communities safer, the time to act is now.
New Zealand's racing to enact new gun reform measures 3 days after a white supremacist gunman shot dead 50 Muslim worshippers at 2 mosques in the city of Christchurch. We'll speak with the Australian activist who led a campaign to overhaul Australia's gun laws 2 decades ago after a massacre that killed 35 people. Plus, we'll speak to a leading scholar on Islamophobia and a former white supremacist who now campaigns against radicalization. Then to the global strike for climate change inspired by 16-year-old Swedish high schooler Greta Thunberg.
The last time I checked, there were over 123 countries where there were going to be strikes today, and 2,052 places, cities.
An estimated 1.4 million children across 125 countries took part in a global climate strike Friday to demand world leaders do more to address climate change. We'll speak to 2 strike leaders. In Minneapolis, 10th grader Isra Hersey, the daughter of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and Alyssa Chen, a senior at the Bronx High School of Science. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Mourners gathered over the weekend in New Zealand and around the world to pay tribute to the victims of Friday's deadly terrorist massacre at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. The death toll has reached 50, with at least 50 people injured. Police have arrested and charged 28-year-old Australian Brenton Tarrant, who they say acted as a lone gunman and is described as a right-wing anti-immigrant white supremacist. Tarrant live-streamed the attack and published a manifesto in which he praised President Donald Trump as a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose. In the wake of the horrific attack, the deadliest shooting in New Zealand's history, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern vowed to reform the country's gun laws.
We cannot be deterred from the work that we need to do on our gun laws in New Zealand. They need to change, regardless of what activity may or may not have happened with gun retailers. They will change.
Meanwhile, President Trump came under fire for refusing to acknowledge the global rise of white nationalism in the wake of the attack.
We see today white nationalism as a rising threat around the world.
I don't really. I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. I guess if you look at what happened in New Zealand, perhaps that's a case. I don't know enough about it yet. They're just learning about the person and the people involved. But it's certainly a terrible thing.
Trump tweeted more over the weekend about the late Senator John McCain and advocating for Fox News to bring back host Jeanine Pirro, who appeared to be suspended after attacking Congressmember Ilhan Omar on air for wearing a hijab last week, than he did about the New Zealand massacre. He did not tweet once in more than 20 tweets about the massacre. Security experts and government agencies have warned that white nationalist attacks are on the rise and pose a major domestic threat. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security said in 2017 white supremacist groups carried out more attacks in the U.S. than any other domestic extremist group since 2001. On Sunday, White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney was asked on Fox News if Trump would deliver a speech condemning white supremacy and Islamophobia, to which he responded, "The president is not a white supremacist. I'm not sure how many times we have to say that." President Trump signed his first presidential veto Friday after lawmakers in both houses of Congress voted in favor of a resolution reversing Trump's declaration of a national emergency on the U.S.-Mexico border. He once again attacked immigrants as he signed the veto.
It is a tremendous national emergency. It is a tremendous crisis. Last month, more than 76,000 illegal migrants arrived at our border. We're on track for 1 million illegal aliens to rush our borders. People hate the word invasion, but that's what it is. It's an invasion of drugs and criminals and people. We have no idea who they are.
Trump's statement came just after the manifesto of the New Zealand attacker was released, in which he echoed that term invasion. The veto sends the measure back to lawmakers, but they're not expected to garner the two-thirds majority required to overturn it. California and other states filed a lawsuit last month challenging Trump's national emergency. The Ethiopian transport minister said early investigations have revealed clear similarities between the crashes of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 and October's Lion Air Flight 610 in Indonesia. While detailed information is yet to be released, flight tracking data shows both flights on the Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft seemed to go through unpredictable climbs and then a nosedive after they took off. Both flights killed all crew and passengers on board after the planes crashed minutes after takeoff. The Wall Street Journal reported Sunday the Transportation Department is launching investigations into regulators' approvals of the Boeing 737 MAX 8, as well as into the development of the aircraft. Faulty flight control software has been cited as a possible culprit in the two fatal crashes. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced Friday the U.S. will start denying visas to members of the International Criminal Court who may be investigating alleged war crimes by the U.S. military in Afghanistan.
In November of 2017, the ICC prosecutor requested approval to initiate an investigation into, quote, the situation in Afghanistan, end of quote, that could illegitimately target American personnel for prosecutions and sentencing. I'm announcing a policy of U.S. visa restrictions on those individuals directly responsible for any ICC investigation of U.S. personnel.
In response to the news, the ACLU said, quote, this is an unprecedented attempt to skirt international accountability for well-documented war crimes that haunt our clients to this day, unquote. In more news about the ICC, the Philippines officially withdrew from the court Sunday. The International Criminal Court is investigating whether the thousands of murders committed as part of President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs amounts to crimes against humanity. At least 5,000 people have been killed by the police since 2016, with many more killed in extrajudicial raids and attacks. Students around the world left the classroom and took to the streets Friday for the Youth Climate Strike, calling for decisive action on climate change. The International Day of Action was inspired by 16-year-old Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, who started a weekly Friday strike outside the Swedish Parliament building last year. This is Thunberg speaking at the Stockholm demonstration.
And we, the young people, have not contributed to this crisis. We are not going to accept it. We are not going to let it happen, and that is why we are striking. We strike because we want a future, and we will continue.
Greta Thunberg has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Here in New York City, Democracy Now! Spoke to students rallying outside City Hall Friday.
My name is Tasnim Imu, and I'm from Urban Assembly Institute of Math and Science for Young Women. They say that education isn't worth sacrificing to make a political point, but I think they're wrong, because we're all here going to school and we think that we have this big future for us, but our education will be ignored if we're too busy trying to survive instead of living.
Later in the broadcast, we'll speak with the high school students from the Bronx High School of Science, as well as Ilhan Omar, Congressmember Ilhan Omar's daughter in Minneapolis. At least 2 people have died, with thousands more displaced as historic levels of flooding in the upper Midwest due to heavy rains and melting snow from last week's bomb cyclone led to states of emergency in the region. Nebraska saw its worst flooding in half a century, prompting concerns about a nuclear power plant located along the Missouri River, although authorities say the plant continued to operate as usual through the weekend. In Zimbabwe and Mozambique, at least 120 people are believed to be dead, with many more missing after tropical cyclone Idai battered the southern African nations from Thursday to Saturday. The death toll is expected to mount in what Mozambique's environment minister called the biggest natural disaster the country has ever faced. In Indonesia, major flooding and landslides in the eastern Papua region killed at least 77 people over the weekend, according to officials. Thousands were forced to evacuate their homes. Also in Indonesia, a landslide triggered by a 5.5 magnitude earthquake on Lombok Island killed at least 2 people Sunday. In Israel, the Supreme Court banned the far-right leader of the Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power Party, from running in the upcoming elections, citing racist anti-Arab comments by Michael Ben-Ari. Last month, embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu formed an alliance with the party, despite it being compared to the KKK for its racist and homophobic beliefs. Meanwhile, the court ruled candidates from the Balad United Arab List, an alliance of Israeli Arab parties, can run, overturning a ban by Israel's election committee earlier this month. In Denver, Colorado, noted immigrant rights activist Jeanette Vizguera once again took sanctuary at the Unitarian Church after her stay of deportation expired Friday. She spent 86 days in sanctuary at the church in 2017 before receiving her stay of deportation. Vizguera also announced she is suing Immigration and Customs Enforcement for denying her right to due process in her immigration battle. Jeanette Vizguera spoke to supporters at the Denver church Friday.
It's ridiculous to call it a national emergency. They want to put up a wall when there are national emergencies inside the country like public health, the environment, housing. We have lots of youth who, when they come on hard times, must sleep on the streets. They are American citizens, and they are not extending a helping hand to them.
In Kentucky, a federal judge blocked the new highly restrictive so-called fetal heartbeat law hours after Republican Governor Matt Bevins signed the legislation Friday. The law would have banned abortions once a fetal heartbeat can be detected, something that typically happens just 6 weeks into a pregnancy and before many women even realize they're pregnant. The measure is now on hold for 2 weeks pending further hearings. Staffers on the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign announced Friday they're unionizing in what's believed to be a first for any major presidential campaign. The president of United Food and Commercial Workers Local 400, which will represent the Sanders campaign staffers, said, quote, "We expect unionizing will mean pay parity and transparency on the campaign with no gender bias or harassment and equal treatment for every worker, whether they're in Washington, D.C., Iowa, New Hampshire, or anywhere else," unquote. Several women staffers accused Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign of not properly handling sexual harassment and unequal pay complaints. And New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand officially launched her 2020 presidential bid Sunday. In her campaign video entitled Brave Wins, Gillibrand pledged support for paid family leave, universal health care, a Green New Deal, gun control, and taking money out of politics. She was also an outspoken early supporter of the Me Too movement, but reports emerged earlier this month that her office mishandled a sexual harassment complaint from a former staffer. Senator Gillibrand is inviting supporters to meet her for a rally on March 24th in front of the Trump International Hotel in New York. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 50 people are dead, and millions around the globe are mourning following the massacre at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, Friday. The terrorist attack unfolded during Friday prayer when a lone gunman, an avid white supremacist, opened fire on worshippers while live streaming the attack on Facebook. It was the deadliest shooting in the country's modern history. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern described Friday as one of New Zealand's darkest days and vowed to change the country's gun laws.
The terror attack in Christchurch on Friday was the worst act of terrorism on our shores. It was, in fact, one of the worst globally in recent times. It has exposed a range of weaknesses in New Zealand's gun laws. The clear lesson from history around the world is that to make our communities safer, the time to act is now.
Police have arrested and charged a 28-year-old Australian man named Brenton Tarrant, an anti-immigrant white supremacist who published a manifesto in which he praised President Donald Trump as a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose, unquote. But Trump has refused to acknowledge the global rise of white nationalism in the wake of the attack, saying, "I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems, I guess," he said. In New Zealand, the Muslim community is mourning the dead, the youngest among them 3 years old. Muqad Ibrahim was murdered after being separated from his brother and father in the chaos at the Al-Nur Mosque. The terror began in the early afternoon Friday in central Christchurch when the gunman entered the Al-Nur Mosque and opened fire on worshippers gathered for Friday prayer. The shooter live-streamed the massacre, shooting dead one man who attempted to tackle him and killing 41 more in a 6-minute rampage. At one point, the gunman went to his car to get another weapon and returned to the mosque to kill more people. A paramedic said, quote, "There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque." The shooter drove away before police arrived on the scene and headed 4 miles east to a second mosque, the Linwood Mosque, where he once again opened fire on worshippers, this time through a window. That's when Abdulaziz, who was praying at the Linwood Mosque with his sons, ran towards the attacker, flinging a credit card machine at him and causing him to drop his shotgun. The gunman then ran to his car, and Aziz threw the shotgun, shattering the car window. The shooter drove away, leaving 7 dead at the Linwood Mosque. This is Abdulaziz describing his encounter with the attacker.
He dropped his gun and ran, and I chased him. He sat on his car, and what I did, I had that shotgun in my hand, and I threw on him like an arrow. I threw the shotgun, and that shotgun actually smashed his window, and I could see him is frightened. Then he swore at me, and he just took off.
Minutes later, New Zealand police apprehended the shooter. The first call to police from Al Noor Mosque came at 1:41 p.m. The gunman was arrested at 2:17 p.m. 49 people were dead. 1 more would later die in the hospital. The shooter reportedly used 5 guns to carry out the attack, including 2 semi-automatic assault weapons. New Zealand's Attorney General David Parker told Radio New Zealand, quote, "We need to ban some semi-automatics, perhaps all of them," unquote. Well, for more, we're going to Rebecca Peters in Sydney, Australia, an international arms control advocate, member of the International Network on Small Arms. She led the campaign to reform Australia's gun laws after the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, when a gunman shot dead 35 people. After the attack, Australia cracked down on gun violence, outlawing automatic and semi-automatic rifles. More than 640,000 weapons were turned into authorities in a nationwide buyback. Rebecca Peters, welcome back to Democracy Now! First, your response to what happened in neighboring New Zealand. You're in Australia now, where the gunman is from. And then talk about the immediate call of the New Zealand Prime Minister to deal with gun control immediately, even faster than you did after the Tasmanian massacre.
Well, Amy, of course, it was just so devastating and heartbreaking to hear that yet another atrocity of this sort had taken place. We're accustomed to hearing about these things happening in the United States, but we've got out of the habit in Australia since we don't have them anymore. And it was just shocking to realize that it had occurred in New Zealand and that it was an Australian who had carried out this horrific attack. And I suppose for those of us who have worked on the issue of trying to prevent gun violence, in addition to being heartbreaking, it was heart-sinking because there'd been plenty of warnings and of advice over the years that New Zealand should strengthen its gun laws, but those warnings and advice had never been heeded.
Let's go back to New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern.
I want to also acknowledge, when Australia found itself tragically in a similar position to what we find ourselves now, they took 12 days to make their decision. We have taken 72 hours. There is, though, still some detail that needs to be worked through. I want to do that, but still move as quickly as we can.
So that's the New Zealand Prime Minister. Rebecca Peters, explain what happened in Australia. I mean, a country, it's believed, of crocodile Dundees or gun lovers. How quickly this turned and what you're seeing is being demanded right now in New Zealand.
Well, in Australia, you're right. We are an outdoor country. We're a frontier country. We have a lot of people who like to use guns. And in that sense, we're similar to New Zealand. We're culturally very similar as well. But the laws had been there was a patchwork of laws across the country. Each state had different laws, and many of them were not very strong. So, for example, semi-automatic weapons were available in some states, but banned in other states. Some states had registration of all guns and some did not. And what that meant was that it was possible to take advantage of the loopholes provided by the weaker law states to commit gun violence. And in 1996, we had a mass shooting at Port Arthur in Tasmania. 35 people were killed, and at the time it was the largest tragedy of that type ever in the world. Unfortunately, it's been surpassed since then. And although there had been many attempts to reform the laws, the politicians had always been intimidated by the gun lobby and had been reluctant to do anything. But in 96, we had a brand new prime minister, and he said, I'm going to fix this. And so he called all the states together and said, we're going to once and for all fix this problem. And they came up with a scheme of a list of points that all the states agreed to put into their laws as a minimum standard. And that included a ban on semi-automatic rifles and shotguns, a buyback, as you mentioned, to get rid of them, registration of all guns in every state, much higher standard of licensing, including the need to prove that you have a legitimate reason, and a lot of other, a 28-day waiting period, and various other measures which basically close the loopholes and raise the standard and we've been much safer ever since. The first thing that obviously comes to mind when an atrocity like this happens is the question of semi-automatic weapons. And the Prime Minister of New Zealand correctly mentioned that as a priority. And in Australia, as Jacinda Ardern mentioned, it took 12 days for this agreement to be nutted out. It had to be negotiated between eight states, but that was obviously pretty quick. In New Zealand, she has announced pretty well immediately that they plan to make reforms. My slight concern is that they should take the time to consider not just piecemeal changes, like not just banning military assault weapons, but looking at all the reforms that need to be made, because the New Zealand gun law is full of loopholes. It's basically the same as Australia's worst laws were about 20 years ago. So what kind of gun lobby does New Zealand have? Is it similar to Australia? And why didn't New Zealand pass the same kind of legislation when you did back in back in the time of the Tasmanian massacre? In 96, yes. It was so originally New Zealand should have joined that scheme because the scheme was developed under the auspices of something called the Australasian Police Ministers' Council. We have a police minister in every state, and New Zealand also has a police minister. And the word Australasian means Australia and New Zealand. And our two countries work together on policing questions a lot, on crime prevention and investigation. And it made sense for New Zealand also to pass the same sort of gun laws that were being passed in Australia. But the gun lobby is very powerful in New Zealand. And basically, and at the time it was the National Party government, which is more susceptible to the gun lobby because it sees its strength as being in the rural areas. And basically the idea of joining the Australian scheme was vetoed by the gun lobby, which was a huge shame because they didn't make the progress that they should have made. New York Times reported Friday New Zealand's almost alone with the United States in not registering 96% of its firearms. And those are its most common firearms, the ones most used in crimes, Rebecca. Yeah, and that was the case in at least 3 Australian states 20 years ago. The only firearms that were registered were handguns, but most guns are not handguns, and so yes, it means that for the vast majority of guns in New Zealand, there's no record of who has them or where they are. There's no ability to know when a person becomes ineligible to have a gun. There's no way of knowing if they have it, and therefore there's no way of taking it away from them. Like in Australia, the most common reason for losing your license is domestic violence. And we have registration of guns. So if a person loses their license, the police also know how many guns they actually have. The other thing about registration, which is just so crucial, is if you have a licensing system, New Zealand does have a licensing system, although it's very easy to get a license. The idea of a licensing system is only a person with a license is allowed to have a gun. But if you don't have a registration system, then there's nothing to keep a licensed gun owner accountable. Like if I have a license and I buy a gun, since there's no registration, I can easily sell it or give it to you, even though you don't have a license, and there's no chance that I'll be caught. And so registration is absolutely crucial to make sure that your licensing system works. And those are the kinds of things that the New Zealand government should look at. Those are the sorts of loopholes they should look at closing, rather than just focusing on banning assault weapons. And they mention assault weapons a lot, and obviously they should be banned. But the tricky thing with semi-automatic rifles is that there are semi-automatic rifles that are not considered to be assault weapons, but that can be modified so that they become assault weapons. And that's why in Australia, all semi-automatic rifles were banned, to avoid the problem of people buying non-assault weapons and modifying them to become assault weapons. So New Zealand should take that same step.
Well, Rebecca Peters, I want to thank you for being with us. International Arms Control Advocate, member of the International Network on Small Arms, led the campaign to reform Australia's gun laws after the Port Arthur massacre. One last question. The laws were changed in 1996 in Australia after 35 people were killed in Tasmania. How many massacres have there been since?
Well, since then, we've never had another one of these public mass shootings of the type that we used to have a lot of. What we have had is a couple of family killings where a father has killed his family while they were asleep, for example. But that's a different type of phenomenon, and it doesn't require a semi-automatic. Well, but when you think about these kinds of events that that the U.S., for example, is so plagued by, and the type of event we had in '96, the one that's just occurred in New Zealand, we've never had another event like that.
Rebecca Peters, thanks so much for being with us. We can't count the number of times in the United States. It has been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in this last 23 years. This is Democracy Now! We'll link to your piece in the Sydney Morning Herald, headlined, "It Didn't Have to Be This Way, How the Gun Lobby Made New Zealand Less Safe." This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll look at Islamophobia and white supremacy. Stay with us.
Here's to your garden, here's to your kids. Heard you were in the neighborhood. I've been a long time on a skid. And baby, I'm beside you. You run from the river when it long ran over you. This is for you standing up to a bone-chilling wind. This is for the failures you collected from our sin. And this is for your lonesome tears I never dried. This is for you hanging in the hope that it never died.
Beside You by Tim Finn, Vikrunga, and Dave Dobbin of New Zealand. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We're continuing our coverage of Friday's massacre in New Zealand when a white supremacist gunman shot dead 50 Muslim worshippers at 2 mosques in Christchurch. We turn now to President Trump's response to the attacks. On Friday, he was asked about the increasing threat of white nationalism.
We see today white nationalism as a rising threat around the world.
I don't really. I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. I guess if you look at what happened in New Zealand, perhaps that's a case. I don't know enough about it yet. They're just learning about the person and the people involved. But it's certainly a terrible thing, terrible thing.
On the same day of the massacre in New Zealand, that was Friday, President Trump signed his first presidential veto after lawmakers in both houses of Congress voted in favor of a resolution reversing Trump's declaration of a national emergency on the U.S.-Mexico border. Trump claimed there was an invasion occurring on the southern border.
Congress's vote to deny the crisis on the southern border is a vote against reality. It's against reality. It is a tremendous national emergency. It is a tremendous crisis. Last month, more than 76,000 illegal migrants arrived at our border. We're on track for 1 million illegal aliens to rush our borders. People hate the word invasion, but that's what it is. It's an invasion of drugs and criminals and people. We have no idea who they are. We're bursting at the seams. You can only do so much. And the only option then is to release them. But we can't do that either, because when you release them, they come into our society. And in many cases, they're stone cold criminals. And in many cases, and in some cases, you have killers coming in and murderers coming in, and we're not going to allow that to happen.
President Trump's use of the word invasion came just hours after the New Zealand gunman issued a manifesto where he described immigrants as invaders. In the same manifesto, the gunman praised Trump as a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose. Well, for more, we're going to Khaled Beydoun, law professor at the University of Arkansas, author of American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear. We're also joined by Christian Picciolini, founder of Free Radicals Project, a nonprofit helping people disengage from hate and violent extremism. Picciolini was a leading neo-Nazi skinhead and far-right extremist in the 80s and 90s, now the author of White American Youth, My Descent into America's Most Violent Hate Movement and How I Got Out. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Khaled Beydoun, can you respond to what happened in New Zealand?
Yeah, generally, first it just kind of struck me as an individual, being Muslim American myself, having family members who wear the hijab, having family members who were going to the mosque. The next day, I myself was going to the mosque. So, it struck a real deep personal chord. Fear, obviously, because this kind of thing can happen in the United States, especially with the kind of brazen rhetoric we see from the president. So before I can kind of wrap my head around, the politics of everything, it was a real kind of moment of chilling fear that set in.
Can you talk about why you decided to start a Twitter thread with images of the victims of Friday's massacre? And what happened when you started posting those pictures?
Yeah, I was doing a lot of media the morning of here in the States after the massacre, and I just felt a bit dissatisfied. There was, a fixation on the terrorist, the manifesto of the terrorist, a lot of, centering of him at the expense of not focusing on the victims. And, given my work on Islamophobia, there's a tendency in mainstream media to kind of clump up specifically Muslim victimhood as, faceless, monolithic, dehumanized sort of blocks of people. So I wanted to take that opportunity to really, put a face on who the victims were, tell their stories, draw real human connections that really resonated with people on social media.
And what was the response to what you started posting?
It was, a series of responses. I think that the most sort of striking responses were after the thread had caught some attention and was, generating an audience. I was getting messages from family members of a lot of the victims, friends of the victims, classmates of the victims telling me more about them, feeding me with more intimate information about who they were. And I tried to compile as much information about these individuals in the rolling thread, again, to humanize these people and show that, the people who were killed, the 50 people, were far more than just statistics. These were individuals who led lives. They were young kids, 3 years old, like you mentioned earlier on with Mukad Ibrahim. There were individuals who were old as 72, somebody like Saeed Nabi, who was the first identified victim, standing at the door, who welcomed in the terrorist into the mosque. So I tried as much as possible to really put a face on who these people were, illustrating stories, again, that showed that these people were far more than just statistics.
Can you respond to the alleged shooter in his so-called manifesto, more than 80 pages, praising Trump as a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose?
You know, I think that whether it's causation or correlation, this kind of rhetoric that we see from white supremacists at the very top, like President Trump, whether it be words like Islam hates us or using, dog whistles like invasion, this is emboldening, terrorists like the terrorist in New Zealand, Christchurch. We can see the exact same language being used in his manifesto. So, I write in the book, in the American Islamophobia book, that it's important to kind of think about this political rhetoric as far more than just words, but actual dictates that are authorizing individuals on the ground to engage in this vigilante violence and to inflict, extreme, tragedy onto individuals who look like the kind of invaders that Trump is talking about.
Talk more about, what's the title of your book, Khalid Beydoun? American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear.
So the book looks to track the history, the genesis, the evolution of Islamophobia as both a popular but also a state-sponsored phenomenon. What's happened in recent years with the rise of Trump is that Islamophobia has become recognized as a form of animus, a form of bigotry. But in the book, I try to show that this form of animus and this form of racism and anti-religious bigotry has deep roots in the United States, both in the legal system, in the media imagination, in the political discourses. There's an underbelly of anti-Muslim animus that facilitates the emergence of the very brazen Islamophobia we see today, weaponized by people like President Trump or by terrorists on the ground in places like New Zealand who commit massacres like we saw on Friday.
I wanted to bring Christian Picciolini into this conversation, founder of Free Radicals Project, the nonprofit that helps people disengage from hate and violent extremism, leading neo-Nazi skinhead and far-right extremist himself in the 80s and 90s. Talk about your response Friday when you heard what happened in New Zealand and heard about the white supremacist, the white nationalist who opened fire, killing 50 Muslim worshippers.
Well, Amy, this tragedy was similar to the hundreds of tragedies that have been happening since the 80s and 90s. This is not an isolated incident. This is not a fringe problem. This is a transnational terrorist alliance. Dating back to the late 80s and early 90s, there have always been connections to overseas white supremacist groups connected to the United States, and this is no different. But this is also another example of how words matter, especially words from a president, because this is now the third or fourth time, just in a matter of months, where violence has occurred or almost occurred because of words that the president said. What's happened now is the internet has created a platform where propaganda and conspiracy theories are being spread to the farthest reaches of the internet, and it's reaching some of our most vulnerable, marginalized, broken individuals who are unstable, but are taking these narratives and it's fulfilling them, it's empowering them to a certain degree. But the end result is always violence, it's always death. And we just saw another example of that in Christchurch, and I suspect it's not going to be the last one we see.
I wanted to go back to what President Trump said on Friday when he was holding his what he called veto ceremony around defying Congress's wishes, Republicans and Democratic senators and Congress members, and saying he's going to appropriate over $8 billion to build a wall on the border. And a reporter shouted out a question to him about the increasing threat of white nationalism.
We see today white nationalism as a rising threat around the world.
I don't really. I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. I guess If you look at what happened in New Zealand, perhaps that's a case. I don't know enough about it yet. They're just learning about the person and the people involved. But it's certainly a terrible thing, terrible thing.
Terrible thing, he says. Christian Picciolini, respond.
Well, I think the president is either uninformed or he's complicit, because this is a problem that has been very visible in our country, for the last 5 or 6 decades. It started with Timothy McVeigh and really with the Oklahoma City bombing, and it really hasn't stopped since then. In the 80s and 90s, the white supremacist movement had a very concerted strategy to mainstream. We recognized back then when I was involved that we were too edgy. Our shaved heads, the tattoos were putting off the average American white racist. So we decided that we needed to look like them, sound like them, and go where they were. So we encouraged people to grow their hair out, to trade their boots in for suits, and to get jobs in law enforcement, and to go to the military and get training, and also to run for office if they had a clean record. And the fruits of that labor are now coming to fruition. But I can tell you that even 30 years ago, I never would have guessed that we'd be in this position today. But I can tell you also 30 years ago, we didn't have a propaganda center and a command post on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Talk about the importance of the internet in all of this, Christian Picciolini. I mean, as we now know, as what happened on Friday, the shooter, as he opened fire, he live streamed this on Facebook. He live streamed this. We haven't shown any of those images. Facebook would soon take that down. Of course, some caught it. Hours after Friday's attack, the president of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, blamed Trump for the rise of anti-Muslim terror in the U.S. and abroad. This is Nihad Awad.
The terrorist has quoted the most powerful person in the world, President Trump. And I would like to address Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, your words matter. Your policies matter. They impact the lives of innocent people at home and globally. And you should condemn this, not only as a hate crime, but as a white supremacist terrorist attack. And you need to assure all of us, Muslims, blacks, Jews, immigrants, that we are protected and you will not tolerate any physical violence against us because we are immigrants or we are minority. During your presidency and during your election campaign, Islamophobia took a sharp rise, and attacks on innocent Muslims, innocent immigrants, and mosques have skyrocketed. We hold you responsible for this growing anti-Muslim sentiment in the country and in Europe.
So that's Nihad Awad. I'd like you to respond to that, Christian, and also the importance of the internet when it comes to this spread of right-wing white supremacy.
Well, I think a president's words don't just have immediate consequences. They'll have lasting consequences for all the young people who are being born now into this environment of pure extremism. As far as the internet goes, let me paint a picture of who may be on the internet. It's not just our friends and dog pictures, but there are millions of marginalized, alienated, broken young people who are looking for identity, community, and purpose in real life and can't find it there, but they can find it online. And the internet has become flooded since the 2016 election, and even just before that, by propaganda and conspiracy theories coming in from Eastern Europe and from Russia. And it's very difficult to not land on some of this propaganda. But they're also going to some of the most, the places where some of the most vulnerable people are. Depression forums, online autism forums. They're talking to our children over headsets when they're playing multiplayer gaming. And they're trying to recruit them with these narratives that are mimicking what the president is saying. And because there are so many people online who are not able to potentially establish those relationships in real life, they can build whatever identity, community, and purpose they want. and the narratives are being given to them. And this has become the fastest growing underground social movement that I've ever seen in my lifetime.
What do you mean online autism forums?
So discussion forums where people are discussing, living with autism, or even Facebook groups. But it doesn't stop there. They're going to where vulnerable people go to find help, to talk to other people, or even where young people might go where they're looking for that sense of identity, community, and purpose. This is really no different than what I used to do 30 years ago when I used to look for vulnerable people outside of arcades or outside of punk rock concerts or skate parks. Because the idea is you are banking on the fact that somebody there is going to feel marginalized, is going to have what I call potholes that deviated their path, those things that appear in life like trauma, abuse, poverty, mental illness, that maybe alienate them from the rest of society, and then they promise them paradise.
I wanted to go to the Australian lawmaker who's been publicly shamed for his comments following Friday's massacre, in which he said immigration is to blame for the terrorist attack. Queensland Senator Fraser Anning said the real cause of bloodshed on New Zealand's streets today is the immigration program, which allowed Muslim fanatics to migrate to New Zealand in the first place. On Saturday, while Anning was addressing reporters in Melbourne, Australia, 17-year-old William Connolly stood behind him and cracked a raw egg on the back of his head. The far-right politician immediately swung around and punched the teenager in the face. He then attacked the teenager again before the two were forcibly separated. A group of men then tackled Connolly to the ground and placed him in a chokehold. Connolly was briefly arrested before being released without charge. The Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has sided with the teenager, condemning Anning's comments and saying the lawmaker should be charged for assaulting Connolly. Let me ask Khalid Beydoun your response.
Yeah, first the rhetoric of Anning, Senator Anning's, were, pretty much echoing what President Trump has been saying for a long time. One additional point I want to make, besides rhetoric and words from politicians, it's important to also focus on how policies, right? We have a standing Muslim ban in the United States, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court, which echoes what President Trump is saying, but then emboldens what individual, private terrorists like the one in New Zealand go on and do. So there's policy and there's also rhetoric. But I think that we all, sort of champion what Connolly did. I think that he, demonstrated the kind of frustration that individuals had intellectually with the kind of rhetoric politicians are making against immigrants. And I'm happy that the Prime Minister of Australia sided with the kid, condemning that rhetoric, especially after the massacre. For a senator to say that after a massacre is just egregious.
I wanted now to go to Mick Mulvaney. This was truly an astounding moment. The acting chief of staff of President Trump, who was speaking on Fox News. This is the chief of staff of the President of the United States, who found it necessary to say this.
The president is not a white supremacist. I'm not sure how many times we have to say that.
The president is not a white supremacist. I'm not sure how many times we have to say that, he said. Christian Picciolini, you come out of that movement. You were an avowed, proud white supremacist for decades in the 80s and in the 90s. President Trump tweeted this weekend over 20 times. Not once did he mention the massacre. Can you respond to what Mick Mulvaney says? How do you define white supremacy? It is your life. You were a white supremacist for years, and now you fight against it and try to bring people out of this whole movement.
Yeah, I think, just like hatred, white supremacy is born of ignorance. Fear is its father, and isolation is its mother. When we don't understand something and we become afraid of it, sometimes that turns into hate. I think a lot of, policies that have come out of this administration have mimicked things that 30 years ago I would have applauded. In fact, white supremacists today are applauding this president's policies and even his words. And then in return, on occasion, the president will retweet a conspiracy theory from a white nationalist. This is a problem because, one, we're not calling it out. We obviously have very open wounds in the United States that deal with racism. That's still affecting people. And it's something that we shouldn't really take lightly because now it has turned into direct action against people of color, against Jewish people, against Muslims, and against even the media and politicians. And this is something that words really have consequences. I can tell you, Amy, 30 years ago, I wrote racist music and racist lyrics, and I performed those and sold that music. Well, I never really thought that it had gone anywhere, but 30 years later, that music got into the hands of Dylan Roof, who posted my lyrics on a white supremacist message board just 4 months before walking in to the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. Mm-hmm. And that is the power, and those are the consequences of our words. And like I said earlier, President Trump's words are going to have lasting implications for our democracy, for our children growing up, and for citizens now who are in fear of their lives because we can't even acknowledge that there's a problem, let alone we're not prepared to address it. In 2007, Daryl Johnson with the Department of Homeland Security called out the fact that white supremacy was on the rise. And that, under President Obama, that was shelved. So this goes back a long period in our history. This certainly isn't just President Trump, but I can tell you that for the first time in modern history, our president's words are actually causing people to murder each other.
And again, the alleged shooter in New Zealand praised Donald Trump, also praised Dylan Roof and talked about what an inspiration he was. And yes, it's very important to talk not only about what happened there, but also to talk about what happened in Pittsburgh with the killing of the Jews, the same language used, the Jewish worshipers there at the Tree of Life Synagogue, talking about invaders and invasion. And that's the same language that President Trump used once again on Friday, hours after the manifesto came out, repeating those words. I want to end by reading a few of the names of the victims of the Friday massacre at the New Zealand mosques. Among the dead are 71-year-old Haj Daoud Nabi, 44-year-old Husna Ahmed, father of 2 Lilik Abdul Hamid, and 3-year-old Mukad Ibrahim. Just 4 of the 50 people, the 50 lives lost in the terrorist attack. The Muslim community in New Zealand and millions of people around the world are mourning their deaths. I want to thank Khalid Beydoun, law professor at University of Arkansas, author of American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear, and Christian Picciolini, founder of Free Radicals Project, was a white supremacist himself in the 80s and 90s, and has written a number of books on this issue, among them White American Youth, My Descent into America's Most Violent Hate Movement and How I Got Out. When we come back, young people take to the streets around the world to demand change around climate change. Stay with us.
You're running behind the time, speeding up online, using cars and trains, cruising by aeroplanes, catching the stars above. But when is the time for love? You're searching for paradise. It's here, look into my eyes. I'm an island, surrounded by the sea. My beloved enemy.
I'm an Island by Bernadette LaHangst. The song is written for the opening of the Conference of the Climate, or COP23. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Up to 1.4 million young people around the world took part in a global climate strike Friday to demand world leaders do more to address the dangers of climate. Strikes were reported in 125 countries. The mass protests were sparked by 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who skips school every Friday to sit outside the Swedish parliament to demand leaders act on climate. On Friday, Greta spoke at her rally in Stockholm, Sweden.
The last time I checked, there were over 123 countries where there were going to be strikes today, and 2,052 places, cities.
Greta Thunberg was just nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Here in New York, students held a climate strike rally outside City Hall.
My name is Diego Delgado. I go to the Bronx Academy for Software Engineering. The reason I came here with my flag of Puerto Rico is because I wanted to show support for the island. I want to show support for the rest of the Caribbean because it's a very low-lying area that needs to have support put onto it because the oceans are rising very quickly and these are very susceptible to that, as well as the fact that Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and other islands in 2017. Many still haven't recovered. 3,000 people died in Puerto Rico, including members of my own family. And I think it's an issue that the United States did not focus enough on, and Puerto Rico did not receive enough aid from the United States. So it just goes to show that climate change is killing people already, and the U.S. has complete inaction on it.
My name is Zoe, and I go to the Brooklyn Free School. My sign says fracking no, because fracking is wrong, and there's nothing good about it. And it like causes earthquakes. It pollutes the water around it, so people and animals can die. It's horrible.
When our planet's under attack, what do we do? Don't fight back. When our planet's under attack, what do we do?
My name is Tasnim Imu, and I'm from Urban Assembly Institute of Math and Science for Young Women. They say that education isn't worth sacrificing to make a political point, but I think they're wrong because we're all here going to school and we think that we have this big future for us, but our education will be ignored if we're too busy trying to survive instead of living.
Sea levels are rising, and so
Some of the voices here in New York at this part of the global climate march. For more, we're joined in New York by 18-year-old Alyssa Chen, one of the organizers of the walkout at New York's Bronx High School of Science. Alyssa, it's great to have you with us. We saw you out there speaking to the crowd. Why did you organize Bronx Science?
All right. Well, for a long time, I felt like I was the only one in my school who felt very strongly about this and felt like we needed to have a presence in this march. But apparently I was joined by 3 other very passionate individuals in my school, one of which, named Azalea Danes, had created her own Instagram account and mobilized hundreds of our students to follow it and keep up with this climate strike that we were organizing. And then for 2 weeks straight, with like barely any sleep, we worked on a 7-page proposal to our school administration. We worked on the logistics behind this walkout, that we were going to walk out to this park outside of our school and give speeches in the bleachers and be able to mobilize these people and make them feel very, angry at the government for what it has not done to address climate change.
What do you want Mayor de Blasio to do?
I want Mayor de Blasio to recognize that we have a voice in this, that we have the ability and the passion and the will to really move this forward and solve the climate crisis. Because if politicians today are not addressing this, and those are the ones in office right now, we are the ones who want our voices heard.
President Trump has called immigration a national emergency. What do you respond to him?
I respond to him that climate change is the real, demanding, existential issue of today, not to ignore immigration, not to devalue the issue, but I think he's drawing the attention away from the biggest elephant in the room, from what our country as the second highest polluter in the world.
Do you think climate change is a national emergency?
Yes. I thoroughly believe so, and I believe that scientists across the nation and the world also agree with me.
Alyssa Chen, I want to thank you for being with us, 18-year-old senior at Bronx High School of Science. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.